Hello, and welcome to SecureTalk, a podcast where we explore the critical world of information security innovation and compliance. I'm your host, Justin Beals, founder and CEO of StrikeGraph. Together with our expert guests, we'll provide you tools and tips to help your business thrive in the rapidly evolving cybersecurity environment. Hi, everyone, and welcome to SecureTalk. This is your host, Justin Beals. We've been talking about privacy for some time, and it's been an area of deep concern for many of us, whether we're developing a piece of software that stores a lot of personal information or we're concerned about our own personal information. And certainly, each of us in our understanding of what we deserve to have private, what privacy means, and when we want to share information has been evolving rapidly. One of the areas that is new to the privacy landscape is the use of data scraping and AI models specifically. We've seen some of the large generative models consuming a lot of public information on the internet in which to develop their models, and even then sometimes data that was copyrighted or considered private seems to creep into some of these AI systems. Of course, the liability generally exists for the companies that develop these models. If they fall afoul of GDPR or HIPAA, a privacy law, they have the risk of being sued, of course, let alone fines or other actions from the governments in which they operate and need to maintain a good relationship with. Well, today we're going to talk about one of the leaders on the AI privacy side. Specifically Dan Clarke, who is the president of Truio. Truio is an automated consent and data privacy rights management solution. Dan has had 30 years of experience combining technology with media, retail, and business leadership. He has held an executive leadership role at Intel and is an experienced data privacy advisor and been a CEO 9 times over. Dan Clarke has a deep expertise in the privacy landscape, and he speaks frequently at public venues on the topic. He is also actively involved in the Arizona, Texas, and federal privacy legislation. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Dan to the podcast. I'm certainly excited to talk to him today about how AI is changing both the danger, the opportunity, and the methods of creating privacy. Dan, thanks for joining us on SecureTalk today. We really appreciate you spending some time sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we love a good origin story here at SecureTalk. And so one of my first questions is almost always about how you got started in computing. Could you tell us a little bit about your interest in engineering early on and your early days at Intel?
Sure. I grew up on a farm in Ohio, and I always had a desire to know how things work and, rebuilding the tractor and understanding how the TV worked, and ended up going off to college to be an engineer. I went to work for the government for a little while, and I didn't love that. So I went to a startup and then ended up at Intel after they acquired it. And, I actually joined Intel in 1987 when it wasn't that huge of a company. And I actually got a chance to work for Pat Gelsinger, who's now the CEO of Intel.
Wow.
Before he left and came back. And I was actually on the team that helped introduce the laptop to the world. Just to be clear, I was a very low-level person at the time. I was a peon, but I was on the team that actually helped introduce that very world-changing device to the world. I often am asked about AI, where we focus now, and trying to find a comparison. And often, a few people know that I was on that team at Intel. Intel people know me from that. There's just nothing that is as life-changing as AI is to us. Even when you think about the original laptop, this is something that we knew was going to be transformative. Nobody really knew it was going to be this different. And, the mobile devices that you have, everything kind of leads back to that original concept that Intel had I guess some companies had. But AI is it's dramatically more transformative to the world. And I feel like it's hard to find an analogy. Maybe it's like electricity or the web in the beginning. And I feel like I have some experience to understand those big changes in the world.
Yeah, I like to describe them as paradigm shifts. And it's funny. I think it's one of those intrinsic motivators about computer science is when you're around and you experience one or you see it start to take place, especially as you recognize what the vision is for it, it makes you want to come back to the well. I was a peon. I was working for British Telecom. We were rolling out a global frame relay data network. And I was just continually shocked by how powerful it was, how small the world was getting. And it was that paradigm shift that was really exciting. I didn't know that about the laptop. I remember the old Compaq where you had to pull the keyboard out and there was a little screen in there. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a luggable, not really a portable. There was a key technical innovation that enabled you to use a battery called SMI, and that's what really enabled the whole world. But I'll tell you another little bit about my origin when it comes to privacy, governance, compliance, because that was not my background at all. What started me in this was I had started dating a woman. Her name's Katerina, my girlfriend today, and we'd been dating for about 6 months. And she called me and she said she was breaking up with me, and I was devastated. Why? And she said, "Well, I know you're dating other women." And I said, "No, I'm not. Hand to God, I'm not." "Why do you think this?" "Well, one of my girlfriends just matched with you on a dating app." And it turns out that the dating app, although I had deleted it really the day that I met her or the week that I met her, turns out in the fine print, there's this thing that says we can retain your profile for up to 2 years. And, for whatever reason, the demographic I fit in, I was a popular profile, and I leaned into that when I was single.
Of course.
They wanted to keep my profile active. And so her girlfriend had matched with me on this. And so I thought, well, how could this be true? Well, I contacted the company. I said, "I want you to delete my information." They said no. And it turns out that 8 years ago, before we had privacy protection, that they had no obligation to allow me to have control of my data. And so I did a little something funny. I happened to speak pretty good German, and I knew that GDPR had just started. So I submitted the same request, but in German from a German URL. And they ended up processing it and deleting my information. And I was able to retain my relationship with this wonderful woman that I'm still with today. But it really made me very passionate about people have a right to control their own data. And there should be protection for me, not just for deletion, but for correction, for portability. So I'm very passionate about this. And when I founded the company, Truio, we focused initially on abiding by the privacy regulations and now on to governance of AI. But I'm actually very passionate about this topic because of my own personal experience.
That's a shocking realization. I think a lot of us have been through it where we suddenly realize that we don't own our own stories in a way, especially if we put them into a social media application like a dating app. I always think back to that Seinfeld episode where Kramer sold his life stories and he couldn't get them back. He was stuck. And it's shocking. I had a similar experience just last week where I have a list of YouTube channels I subscribe to, and there was a YouTube channel that popped up into it, and I was like, who decided to put that in there? And it was an advertiser kind of infecting my decisions, and I was like, who owns this data? Do I own what I've decided to filter out of the algorithm that I'm looking at, or does the company? And the answer is the company owns how they want to design that algorithm to filter out what I see, and it's frustrating. Yeah.
And I don't think it's fair. I think you should be able to have control over your data. We see attempted abuse of this sometimes. We had a client who had somebody they terminated because it failed a drug test, and then they submitted a request under the privacy laws to delete the data, and thinking that they could then somehow purge this record. That's not the intention. The intention is not to allow you to purge things that you don't like, that they have a right to retain. But this dating app, they had no right to retain my information. I mean, it was a legal clause in the agreement, but it should be my destiny. It should be my ability to control. And I feel very strongly about that.
I like that you introduced this concept of fairness, right? Because is it fair? I think this goes back to the idea of legal basis that we've seen in things GDPR. Like, is there a basis for you to retain that person's data or utilize it in a certain way? Yeah. Well, Dan, I had one other question about your background. I was looking through your resume. It's prolific, my friend. You've held all kinds of roles, especially at an executive level, from COO to CEO now, founder, board of directors. You know, when I see someone that has been able to play a lot of different roles in companies, I'm always curious about what intrinsically motivates you. Like, what drives you day in, day out? Yeah.
Well, at this point in my career, I am driven to be successful. It's probably not about the financial parts as much anymore for me, although that's very important. I have shareholders to answer to. I have to be financially successful. But for me, I like driving a company. I like guiding something. And I think probably the biggest motivator for me personally is helping my staff make money that can be often life-changing. If we, take the company public, if we sell the company, if we exit successfully, if we share profits, if we're really successful, it's not just a few people who benefit from that. It's a lot of people benefit from that. In fact, the only company I ever took public, I had the receptionist and I'm not the most like huggy, cuddly person at work. I'm pretty stringent. But when we took the company public, she, from her big round desk, she came out from behind it and she gave me this huge, like sobbing, crying hug. And she said, I now have enough money to buy a house for my kids. And I never thought I would. And I'll never forget that moment because it can be life-changing for people if you're successful. Yeah.
I get this competitiveness. I have it. I'm interested in competing. Don't always win. Every day's a battle a little bit. And I think for me, what I fundamentally really love is building product with a great team. So a good team, we're building an interesting product. I'm pretty happy. I want the financial outcomes for my broad team when I think about our investors and our shareholders, which these days are employees mostly. Yeah. So let's dive into the innovations in AI. We talked a little bit about it. I'm positive you've been involved in tech as long as I have, longer, I think a little bit, and we've been working in data science for a long, long time. I'm curious the concerns you have, throughout the prior period, not even today. And, when you first started building models, did you have concerns about how they might be used or what algorithms could do? Were you worried?
Not so much earlier on. As you pointed out, we've been doing, call it machine learning or deep learning or automated decision making. We've been doing this for a long time. Myself, at least, I can think of 20 years worth of time that we've been doing this. Intel's probably been doing it even longer. 10 years ago, we were deep into this, doing an enormous amount of it, analytics, advanced analytics, machine learning. What's changed is the large language models have made this accessible to anyone. And that's, to me, the really profound change that's happened. Is it used to be you needed to be a data scientist, you needed to be a programmer. It was difficult to access this technology, and you had to kind of come up with algorithms directly and and really massage the way you approached it. Today, it's incredibly easy to get on ChatGPT or Bard or whatever mechanism you want to utilize. These large language models have made it accessible to everyone. Mm-hmm. And I think that's often where the dangers start to become more important to understand. When we onboard somebody to our AI governance platform, for example, what we find is we look for usage. We look for shadow usage. We used to call it shadow IT. Now we call it shadow AI. And, we scan everywhere. We scan websites. We ask vendors. We ask employees. And what we find is inevitably, we find an enormous number of use cases that have not been reported. What we find with that is if the company has 3 or 4 use cases that they know about, hey, we're using it for analytics in this case, or we're using it, whatever the case might be, most likely they've thought through the risks and they've thought to themselves, what data am I using? Is it have personal information? Could it potentially become biased or abusive in some way? Not to say that you don't still make mistakes in your homegrown applications, but generally what we see is a lot of careful thought about it. Mm-hmm. The ones that get you in trouble are the ones that you didn't know about in the first place. And they're often crafted by people who aren't data scientists, who aren't compliance experts, who are just trying to kind of do something to improve efficiency in the company. But often those are the ones that have the real dangers associated with them. And that really only has become accessible because of large language models in the last 2 years.
Yeah. I was back when we called it algorithmic programming and things like that. I was pretty happy with it, but I did catch a worry when I was working on some features for some human capital management, where we started playing around with unstructured data. So we went from this thing where we would have like a tabular data set where we would say, hey, this piece of data and this information belongs on this row, this column, and has this association, to something like, hey, we're going to take a whole lot of resumes and we're going to feed that into a database and build a model on top of it. We're just going to ask it open-ended questions. And what I noticed is when we started working with unstructured data, our accuracy measures like fell off broadly. And that's where I got really worried. I, as the computer scientist driving the feature set, suddenly felt like I was out of control with how the model was behaving. But that's what these LLMs are a lot, are large unstructured data sets doing their best to respond to a query based upon, that aggregate data set. And the outcomes are hard to predict, when you're thinking about a model and what it's going to tell you.
Well, and I think that goes to the fundamentals of how AI really works. When we look at machine learning, or often the algorithmic programming that you're talking about, it's typically a deterministic approach. You're looking something up, you're comparing something, you end up with a kind of a known predictable answer, whether it's right or wrong. The way AI works is different. It's probabilistic. And because of that, and it kind of needs to be, because of the way it's fundamentally structured. AI in the very beginning, they tried to use, for large language models, they tried to use a deterministic approach, and it really didn't work. You'd end up with these infinite loops, and it didn't really allow it to learn at an exponential level with, billions and even trillions of data points. So they ended up with this idea of making it probabilistic, where you come up with it probably matches this and that. And so you end up in the manifestation of this, from a technical perspective, is that if you're trying to look something up in a database, I want to see a movie number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's actually not good at that at all. Whereas if you say, there's this movie I kind of remember, I think it's in the last 10 years, and it starred an elephant, and it flew around, and what are the possible choices? It's really good at that, whereas machine learning really isn't. But you end up with, it's probabilistic, meaning that it sort of converges on a probable answer, a probable match, but it's not always accurate. And so that's why it is inherently subject to hallucination, and it's inherently subject to the potential for bias because of its fundamental nature. And so I think a lot of the trouble, it's interesting you were worried about this earlier than I was. I didn't really start getting worried about this until about a little less than 2 years ago.
Yeah. I think our use cases were in education and in hiring and firing. And we'd think about the impact to people it could have. And that's what got us concerned. And of course, there's an area of data science that runs deep called psychometrics, which has been explored for a long, long time, which is kind of the measurement of knowledge. And I think it did help guide when we were looking at this stuff. Certainly my work on the computer science side. I always get nervous when I start playing with something that I don't fully understand as an engineer. It gets a little crazy. But, we did have some laws. So when I think about Truio and AI governance, there were some laws that we were dealing with back then. The EEOC had published some guidelines on accuracy and overfitting and bias that we had to follow when we were thinking about algorithms to recommend hiring. Are there any other laws that, I think that you've known from a historical perspective, not maybe what we'll see in the future, that govern kind of responsibility around AI utilization?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring this up. So many people are concerned about the executive order and what's going to happen under the new government. They're concerned about the Colorado law, which is really the seminal law around AI by the states, or the EU's AI Act. I think you should be more concerned about the laws that impact you right now today. Yeah. There's a number of things that are required. Look at under bias and discrimination. It's illegal right now. You've got a bank being sued right now over a gentleman of color who made an application for a job interview, didn't get one. This is public information. He changed the name to, and I'm sorry for the quote, but this is a quote, the whitest name he could think of. Mm-hmm. And he got an interview. This sounds a little like bias. And this is illegal right now. It's illegal under Title VII, and parts of Title IX. This is one of the strongest laws in our land. Every state has ones that often strengthen this. In California, there's even more elements of bias and discrimination law. And the FTC has come out and said this. We've seen the courts already defend this. AI is not somehow exempt from this. Yeah. We saw a court case where they attempted to argue that it's not a human being and it's not a business, and therefore it's somehow exempt. It's not exempt. AI, automated decision making, whatever you want to call it, still has to follow the highest laws of the land. See, bias and discrimination, which is something that AI is sort of inherently subject to because of the way it works. It's probabilistic. It's looking for a bias. It's looking to kind of, as an engineer, you know what I mean by that. It's looking to kind of gravitate towards an answer, and that makes it much more susceptible to bias. But there's other laws too. Privacy laws, 16 states or 17, depending on how you count, Florida, have a privacy law. California, probably the strongest. Colorado has been widely duplicated. Virginia has been duplicated. These say you need reasonable consent to leverage somebody's data. Again, there's no exemption for AI to this. So you need consent to leverage data, which is exactly what AI does. It leverages enormous amounts of data in training and in practice. So the privacy laws apply. You need to think through the consent that's required. Many of the privacy laws also require risk assessments. And these risk assessments, again, they apply to AI. You've got a new use case. You're using it to decide who you're going to promote. You have to think that through. You probably have to do a risk assessment. And by the way, you should anyways. It's like the most important part of the step. It's just, what data am I using and what's the risk? You also have you have cybersecurity laws that require reporting under certain circumstances. You have a number of disclosure laws that are in play. One of the newest ones that we're seeing tested is the wiretap laws. Every state includes some requirement for consent. The idea of you're recording this, you would need I'm sitting in Arizona, you need one party to consent. I consent. In California, you need both parties to consent. Pretty sure you've consented too. So we're good here. But this is now being applied to AI. Peloton is being sued, and this is public information, over not having proper consent to using audio recordings. They put a chat bot on their website. Great idea, helps with peak times and better help. And they wanted to train it thoroughly, not just the FAQs, but all of those prior customer service interactions, that many of which were through audio recordings. It turns out that they probably didn't have the proper consent, at least documented consent, to leverage all that information, or that's what's being alleged in this particular lawsuit, which has survived the first part of the lawsuit, the claim construction phase. So there may be some merit to this question. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily what the wiretap laws were intended to protect, or that this is right or wrong. I'm just saying you have to think about this. Do I really have consent to the data that I'm using to train a model? Do I really have consent to leverage the data that I'm using in real time to make decisions? There's a lot of this being tested today. A lot of us are thinking about the EU's Act and the Colorado AI law and the executive order from the White House. But there's laws right now that you need to pay attention to, and people are getting in trouble over this.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't know that. And the only reason I was aware that there was anything to consider was my work in HR teams around EEOC compliance, around bias. And so we brought it in early in some of our data science work. I also like that you bring up consent, because I think that there's been so much data scraping that's gone on. I don't even think some of these companies know where they got all the data to build their LLMs. And then I to your point, I really wonder how this concept of legal basis in GDPR, and if we were ever to have a larger privacy act in the United States, it would impact us too. But does that company have an actual legal basis to use your data in this way? And I think it's going to get challenged. And I think the law exists today. And I think it's a requirement, which of course leads us to Truio a little bit as a solution. So Dan, you're the CEO at Truio. Will you tell us a little bit about what they do?
Sure. So I'm actually the president.
Thank you.
My partner is the CEO. So Truio is the name of our product. The name of our company is InnerEdge. We're about a 4,000 person software development company with a worldwide footprint, headquartered here in Chandler, Arizona, right next to the Intel campus, where I used to be an executive and where we continue to have a close relationship. Truio was, I co-founded Truio with my partner, Cal Samani, who's the CEO, 8 years ago when GDPR was on the horizon. And Intel looked at that and said, we're getting a lot of legal advice, but people aren't thinking about the operational burdens that come with a privacy law on a company. Not that they were objecting, they just wanted to be prepared. Because under these laws, like we talked about in my own personal experience, you have a right to ask for your information to be deleted. You also have a right to just see your information or correct your information, kind of like Freedom of Information Act requests, but for more generalized companies. This is a significant burden on companies if you have a lot of systems and if you have a lot of complexity, which most large companies do. So Intel set us on a path to develop an automated solution to this. This is used by hundreds of large companies. Many household brand name companies utilize our platform to comply with the world's privacy laws, and to do so in an almost completely automated fashion. About 2 years ago now, in February of last year, so like 20 months ago now, I was actually meeting with the longtime chairman of the FTC. I happen to have a very good relationship there. And we were talking about the potential for a federal privacy law, which I'm a huge advocate of and hasn't happened yet. I have more hope now than I did in the past. But when we were talking about this, it was pointed out to me that there's an element of AI regulation in that draft law, really around automated decision making and avoidance of bias. And they said, AI is kind of good for our country. We're really ahead in this. We're better than almost anybody at leveraging AI and at the fundamentals of it. Many of the companies are really based here. The technology is based here, but people aren't thinking about the guardrails. They're not thinking about how to keep it safe and responsible. And that got me thinking about extending our platform into AI governance. And so in February of last year, we started on the path of building an AI governance extension of our automated privacy compliance platform. And we actually, I think today we celebrated our 1-year anniversary of being in production with this platform.
Yeah.
I believe it was today, or it was yesterday or today. I think we're probably first to market. IBM might be able to make that claim for large language models right about the same time we were releasing our first product. But this is now used by many large enterprise clients to help them govern their AI. How do you keep it safe? How do you keep it responsible? And that's really become most of the focus of Truio is AI governance with privacy compliance, with consent and preference management all built in, but really driven by enterprise clients and how can you keep your AI safe? How can you keep it responsible? How can you make sure that it's governed properly?
Yeah. There was a concept on the website that I read that I was wondering if you could expound upon for us, but this concept of transparent AI practices. What do you think makes up, or what should you consider as transparent AI practices?
Yeah, to me, this is one of the most fundamental elements of governance of AI. So we think about sometimes compliance, the privacy laws. We're really just trying to comply with the privacy laws. Right. Even the best of companies, they have good intentions, but mostly they're just trying to comply with the law. In AI, we call it governance because it's not just about compliance. It's about governing this in a way that's sort of safe and secure and allows you to go fast and take advantage of the profound potential benefits of AI. And to me, what's at the center of that is transparency. Mm-hmm. If you can explain how that application works, what data it's leveraging, you're like most of the way there in making sure that it's safe and responsible. You mentioned using it for resume screening or for determining the potential for promotion or termination. This can actually be a fairly risky application. It's actually a fairly easy one that's a lot of people are doing, but it's one that carries risks with it. Mm-hmm. So understanding that risk, and the reason I talk about transparency so much is you can't be transparent about it if you don't understand it. So the first step in being transparent is to think through, all right, what is that application? What data did I train it on? What data am I leveraging? I'm leveraging, that's a transportation company. I look at how long they've been an employee. I look at their compensation. I look at their the route map that they take, how efficient they are in consumption of fuel. I'm kind of making this up, but what data am I leveraging? And then from that, I have this automated decision making that allows me to rank their performance compared to maybe other people with similar amounts of experience or similar routes or something like that. As soon as you've gone through that exercise and you've just understood your use case, you're going to start thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, am I somehow potentially prejudicing myself against older drivers? Or am I, you start to have that conversation about the risks. To be transparent about it, you're going to want to tell, in this case, in my simple example, you're going to want to tell your employees, hey, this is what we're doing. We look at these 5 factors. It allows us to rank the information. If you feel like this is somehow inaccurate and you want to provide feedback to us, here's a mechanism to do so. We sometimes call that a whistleblower policy, but it's really like an alternative disclosure or correction policy. This allows you to accurately describe to them how you're using it. The very idea of doing so drives understanding of the risk. It's also, by the way, at the center of those new potential laws. California this week went on their automated decision-making technology. They're in rulemaking right now. They entered the formal rulemaking process, even though there was a lot of objections to it. The draft of this, in my opinion, is very focused on notice, which notice is what goes to a consumer or an employee to communicate your use cases. It falls right into transparency. And it's something that says to that consumer or that employee, hey, we're using AI. Here's the way we're using AI. Here's the data we're leveraging. Here's the decisions that we're making. To me, this is really the most fundamental element of being compliant, but more importantly, of just being safe and responsible.
Yeah. Yeah. I think about, being downrange aware. A lot of things we don't understand about these models that we build is that they create an affect with their predictions downrange. Like someone may change how they're behaving based upon what you tell them. And a lot of the risk is caught up in what decisions they might make downrange. And it's easy for us as engineers to turn on a cool tool and be like, look, it does this cool thing. It's very interesting. But what we don't always consider when we put it into production is what the impact is. I'll draw on my experience in education here. When I worked in assessments, we had two categories, low stakes assessments and high stakes assessments. A high stake assessment would pass the child through a grade level. It was a life altering event. And the accuracy of our ability to measure their knowledge mattered for how the rest of their life was going to play out. And we took it very seriously. A low stakes quiz was, a grade level telling us how they were going to do on a high stakes outcome. And we could deal with less accuracy on a low stakes quiz. And so we needed to be transparent about the accuracy capabilities of our predictive models at the end of the day. I love that. And I love that we bring in data as transparency. Like, what did we train it on? It has a lot to do with the impact of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I like the idea of downrange. I haven't used that phrase much, but I'm going to start borrowing that. I like that.
Please.
What's downrange of this? Because ultimately you have to understand what's the potential impact of these things. You also find that the understanding the use case allows you to understand the potential risk. If you're using AI today, like many of us are, to write text, if I'm writing, a letter to my girlfriend, is there really any risk to that? Probably it's literally zero. If I'm using it to write some marketing materials to promote this podcast that we're doing right now, is there really a lot of risk to that? Maybe I'll say it's on the scale of 1 to 10, it's a 1 or something, right? It's very, very, very low. If I'm a pharmaceutical company and I'm writing the description of how a drug works, the risk of using AI in that use case is, to me, like a 10, like it's unacceptably high. So understanding the use case, which is required in order to be transparent, often allows you to really gauge the risk. And it's not fair to gauge them universally, because using it for text generation has different risks depending on what is happening downrange of that text generation.
Yeah. And it's complicated, right? Like, this is a hard question to ask. The answers are not easy to come by. As a matter of fact, I was reading in the National Institute of Science and Technology. They recently released a document called the RMF 1.0 for AI. But they state that the current lack of consensus on robust and verifiable measurement methods for risk and trustworthiness and applicability to different AI use cases is an AI risk measurement challenge. And I think that really hit me, right? Like, we have a risk in that we don't even know how to risk the use of the AI system on some level. Y'all must be thinking about this at Truio. What are the metrics that we want to measure some of the risk or AI models on? Which ones stand out to you?
Yeah. First of all, you have to customize that to the at least to the company, if not to the department or something like that. We have many state and local governments that use our platform. And we find that their risk tolerance, for example, to maybe use of biometrics is to them is this is an extremely high risk utilization. Whereas in the commercial business side, if you're a retailer, let's say, like another one of our customers might be, they might find that to be a minimal risk, a very low risk, or maybe a medium or a low risk. So you have to understand the risk in the environment in which it's being utilized. But to me, the key is to understand your inventory of AI use cases and to understand what data is it leveraging and what decisions that it's making. The metrics that we tend to produce are lots and lots of metrics, as you can imagine, being an automated platform. But it's how many use cases are there? How many were unreported? How often is it being utilized? What data is it leveraging, though? And that's often the most difficult one to come up with. So we've created a dashboard, a risk dashboard that shows you in your environment based on the risk tolerance that you have, for example, for automated text generation or for the utilization of biometrics in your environment. What are your use cases? How much of them are being deployed? And highlighting the ones that are the highest risk in your own opinion. Mm-hmm. Another key metric for us is around training. We feel like training is something that is very important to do in this world. In fact, in the White House executive order, they mentioned the word training 40 times in a relatively short order. And I actually think they kind of got that right. The EU has just recently pulled in the training requirement for the AI Act from most of the provisions are August 2nd of next year, and they've pulled this in now to May of next year. Why is that? Because I think a lot of our problems can be avoided or eliminated with proper training. And the training is really like, how could you get biased with an AI? Most people don't understand that, and they don't even think about it. So they've never thought through to themselves, I wonder if this could get somehow biased. We had a customer that was using AI for resume screening. They hire a lot of people. They're a big company. And they started using an advanced resume filtering program, really just ranking candidates and, are they potentially matched for the job. It found a false correlation between their date of birth and their success in the interview process. And like a good AI, it started applying that into future screening. People don't understand that this is even a possibility. If you train them on the potential risk, you train them on the potential risk of data exfiltration, you put something into a public model, what risk are you taking there? Some of them keep it private, some of them don't. You just have to understand these things. So training metrics is actually one of the ones that we highlight the most in the platform. How many people have been trained? How long did it take them to get trained? What questions, because we always include a quiz, pretty simple quiz. What questions are they missing? Which ones are they getting wrong? Not to punish them for it, but to make sure that this is really clearly understood and that you can understand the risks. We end up then, at the end of the day, we end up with a scorecard of your compliance. And this measures you against the legal environment that you're in. But it fundamentally looks at, okay, how many use cases do you have? Have you really thought through the risks? We don't score you on if you're right or wrong about the risk assessment, but rather, did you do it? Did you actually get all of the data fields that were being leveraged? And did you at least go through and think, yeah, that's okay. No, it's not okay. Did you properly configure it? Did you properly kind of get through this? This gives you a very good idea of how well you're adhering to your own governance principles, to your own governance policies within the company. But those metrics, as you know, as an engineer and as the CEO, metrics are super important. Andy Grove used to say, you can't improve anything you don't measure. Right. You have to measure these things. You have to understand the parameters around your AI usage within your company.
And I would challenge anyone implementing any type of AI feature set at any tier of engineer, from the CTO to a junior engineer. I had two things that I really centered on for us. One is that I felt like I needed to have a really good handle on the accuracy of the model. And I think there's a future where people are like, we measure the caloric content on the food that we eat. You need to say, for this model that I've published, we ran an accuracy test, and this is the amount of false positives, false negatives, true positives, true negatives that we got out of the model. And the other one that I hammer on quite a bit is the bias thing. And you need to build a testing harness for any model you utilize that can run a sample set of data through it to find out if it is biased. Race, any protected class. Yeah.
Yeah, the probably the most important elements of our platform center around bias testing. Mm-hmm. It's we also have the ability to scramble the data or de-anonymize the data. It's often very important so you can train it properly. And we do scan for usage. That's kind of our most popular feature, because you can't understand the inventory of use cases by just asking questions. You have to look for usage and utilization. But bias testing is something that I think is extremely important in anything that has even the slightest potential to become biased, because these things do become biased, and they also drift over time, or they can be deliberately poisoned even with wrong applications. We've seen a case of this of a Latino woman, a brilliant data scientist, who applied for an apartment in New York, and before she did, she created 1,000 bad applicants. You know, people that had been evicted, they had criminal records and horrible credit, all with female Latino names, and ended up then her own application, pristine, got rejected. She had poisoned that model to thinking that particular genre of name equaled a bad risk.
Yeah.
This is not just drift. This is outright poisoning, but you have to test for this. And if we look at the laws today and the litigation landscape today, this is the place where plaintiffs are being the most aggressive. And it's the place where you see the most consistency in both the application of existing law as well as in the new laws. In fact, Colorado, the state law that they have, goes so far as to provide what's called an affirmative defense in the case of if you do proper risk assessment and if you do bias testing. So this is similar. I know you have a high degree of expertise in cybersecurity. Cybersecurity, if you're taking reasonable precautions, you're often not subject to treble damages or to punitive damages. It's a big element of protection if you can demonstrate that you took reasonable precautions. They're kind of trying to do this with the Colorado law, where an affirmative defense that actually switches the burden of proof from the defendant to the plaintiff in certain circumstances. That's a big deal, but you only are accorded that if you've properly considered the risks, but if you've actually tested for bias. New York has even gone farther and required it when you're using it in employment situations. They have to require that you test once a year for bias. I think this actually makes sense. Not that we want to get too much legislation about this in place. On the other hand, it's the right thing to do. If you've got an application that could potentially be biased, nobody wants it to be biased. You know, the bank that's being sued that I mentioned, they came out almost immediately and said, well, we didn't mean to do that.
Right.
Well, the law doesn't have anything to do with what's in your head or your heart. It's just, what are you doing? Had they been testing, they would have been able to observe this, or they certainly would have been in a better position to defend themselves.
Well, and when we build these AI systems, what we mean them to do is not written as precisely as with code, right? Like, I had this struggle where we're like, oh, the model's a black box. We don't really know why it makes the recommendations it does. And I was very frustrated by that as an engineer. And I said, no, we're going to build a methodology where we take our major factors from get fed into the predictive engine, and we're going to adjust them against each other and find out which has what impacts. Because I I get that you can't tell me what the ones and zeros are saying, but we should at least be able to input data and get out how its prediction worked at a statistical analysis. And that gives us an understanding of what bias it may have. I mean, these things are built to have bias, right? We want it to select the best candidate. We want it to give us the best paragraph. We just don't want it to do it in a racist way.
Yeah, you're exactly correct. But I think bias testing is something that should be part of everybody's AI governance plan, not just thinking through the risks that we talked about, but actually testing for bias. Testing for hallucination is another one that can certainly get you in trouble. Air Canada was sued over hallucinating a bereavement policy and basically lost that case and had to abide by it. Their argument again was that they didn't mean to do that. It didn't really exist. It doesn't matter. You're the one presenting this to a consumer. You're accountable for that information. And if it's inaccurate, that's not the consumer's fault or responsibility. So testing for hallucination is actually a lot harder than testing for bias, but you can do some rudimentary things. Ask it the same question 10 times in a row. Ask it a question, that is inflammatory. Ask it a question that you don't want it to answer. Ask your chat bot that you put up on your retail site, ask it about the outcome of the political elections and how that's going to impact the world. It better say nothing to that.
Yeah.
So there's often no answer is often the best answer from a hallucination protection.
Well, Dan, you have a deep expertise and passion in this stuff. It has been a pleasure getting to share that with you, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing. And I'm also very grateful for your kind of vigilance and kind of exposing where we need to adopt ethical practices in the development of technology and these technologies that we use so that we build a better community, right? Like at the end of the day, I think that's the larger outcome. Laws aside, like we all want to get to market, but man, it sure would be great to be trusted as technology providers for trying to be good stewards of our communities. Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me on. I'm definitely passionate about this topic, and I feel like AI has the potential for just profound benefits to our businesses, to our society. The amount of efficiency that it can bring, the amount of changes and transformative elements that it can bring to our daily lives, to our work lives, to our business efficiency is staggering. You should take advantage of it. You should lean into it, but you have to think about how to do it safely, have to think about how to do it responsibly. And often that comes back to this, just understand your use cases. If you can explain it in a transparent way, what's happening downrange, you've probably thought through the data elements and you've probably thought through the potential risks, and you're probably going to be okay most of the time. Think it through. You can be responsible and you can take advantage of this enormous new technology.
Sage advice. Thanks all our SecureTalk listeners for joining us this week. Thanks, Dan. Everybody have a great day.